Hello all, welcome to Art for Lunch today. Today we have Dr. Robert Wellington joining us from the ANU. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and acknowledge their elders both past and present. So today, Dr. Robert Wellington's joining us. He is a lecturer from art history and art theory at the National University of Australia. The co-convener also of our Enchanted Isles and Facial Shores conference here at the NGA, which will be held on March 17 and 18 if you're interested. He is a specialist in the material of intellectual culture of Louis XIV's court, and also the author of the recent publication Antiquarianism and the Visual History of Louis XIV. So Wellington's doctorate was awarded from the University of Sydney. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Wellington.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you so much to the National Gallery team for inviting me to speak today about this intriguing moment of artistic rivalry in the representation of Louis XIV. Of course, the Sun King, the man who develops his father's small hunting lodge into the magnificent Chateau of Versailles, which has inspired both the marvellous exhibition here, Versailles Treasures from the Palace, which I'm sure you've all been to see, and if you haven't, you must go and have a look at it, and of course our conference, which Jessica just mentioned, on the 17th and 18th of March, and we're hoping that our wonderful speakers coming from all over the world, from very illustrious institutions such as the Louvre, the Getty Research Institute and so on, will be able to bring these objects to life for you. So I do encourage you to register if you haven't already, but that's enough of a plug, and let's get into thinking about this rivalry. So what I'm really wanting to do today, I've titled my talk Bernini and the King's Forehead, and this will become, for reasons that will become apparent as we move on. But what I'm really doing for you is, I hope, bringing to life one of the feature works of art that are in the current exhibition at the NGA. This portrait, a bust portrait of Louis XIV, at the age of about 27, coming to the height of his powers. And this portrait is made by an artist working across media. His name was Jean Voran. It's pronounced with a V, Voran. And this bust, as it happens, was one of Voran's first large-scale portraits, and it's quite extraordinary. He's a man who was known for working on a small scale with commemorative medals. Now, commemorative medals I'll talk to you a little bit about in a moment. They're kind of coin-like, but they're not used as currency. They're a particular kind of historical marker to celebrate historical events, and that's really what Jean Voran's known for. But he creates this extraordinary bust, and the reason he does so is quite fascinating, I think. So, we're looking at two contemporaries, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the most famous artist, architect, designer of his day, working as a sculptor most famously, working in theatre production. He also paints, he does everything. He's one of those people who excels at everything that he does, and he's also a great courtier. And he works for the princes of the church, as we call them, the papal families of Rome. He's known across the world by the 1660s, and for that reason, Louis XIV and his cultural advisors decided that it would be a great idea to bring Bernini to France to help cement the representation of this young king. And on the left, we have, as I say, Jean Voran. Now, Jean Voran is a more mysterious figure. He becomes he gets the control of the Royal Mint in 1647, which means that he is in charge of representations, portraits of the kings of France, starting with, well, it starts actually with Louis XIII, but really he becomes the chief person to create the portraits of Louis XIV in coinage. And if you think about that, of all the ways in which the portraits of the king can get out and about, coins are one of the ways that most people would see the king. So Jean Voran is a man who is known for his ability to capture the physiognomy of the king in a way that both celebrates the kind of regal visage of the king, if you like, but also in a way that is very much in keeping with ideas of royal representation that are circulating at court. Here are the two sculptures that we're going to be talking about. A competition between two artists, the quintessential Italian Baroque artist, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, with his flowing forms, that drapery that seems to make the bust float away, the extraordinary transformation of hard materials into soft cloth that we have here on the right. And on the left, Jean Varen's bust, which, with its more static pose, might not have that sensuous appeal for many people. Am I getting my right and left mixed up? Thank you very much, sorry about that. Might not have the same sensuous appeal of the Bernini, and I think for that reason Bernini's bust has come down to us as the quintessential image of Louis XIV. And yet it might surprise you to learn that the French writers of the time of the 1660s said that it was that if this were a competition, Jean Varin won. He was the next Praxiteles. He was the inheritor of great artistic talent from the ancient world. And I think that's a little surprising to us sometimes, so I'm going to try and help us understand why, in fact, that was the case. Gian Lorenzo Bernini comes to Paris, as I say, in 1665. He's brought there, and one of his main artistic projects is to design a new facade for it's the east facade of the Louvre. Now, the Louvre is a palace, has been developed over many, many generations. It starts off as a medieval fortress, and all of the subsequent kind of generations of French kings work to kind of build and enlarge and improve the Louvre. But nobody finishes it. And one of the great ambitions of Louis XIV and his cultural advisors is to finish the Louvre. And they want to do this in spectacular fashion. So they bring their greatest architect of the day, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, to create designs for a new facade. And we can see this is actually one of the rejected designs. Those sensuous curves, convexes and concaves, pushing and pulling in the facade design here, quintessentially Roman Baroque, something that we associate very much with those church facades of Bernini and Borromini that we all love in Rome. But it wasn't very well suited, both to the French. I mean, the design itself wasn't suited to French taste, but it also wasn't suited to the French climate. If we were to look at the plans of this, we'd see that there was a lot of open space, open courtyards, it was open to the elements, and it didn't really suit the kind of application of the French court. They needed more interior space. So after much kind of debate, another design is achieved, and you can see the difference here. Far more formal, far more symmetrical, more, if you like, strictly classical. But there's one lovely element of this design, the design that is actually accepted and almost built, is the fact that we have this kind of palace on a bedrock. It was supposed to look like it was growing out of the ground on a rocky outcrop. That was the idea of the design. That was how Bernini brought his kind of naturalism and sort of taste for kind of extravagance and theatricality into what was otherwise a very formal design. So this design is accepted, and they start to dig foundations. And they even have a ceremony with the king present to commemorate the kind of moment of a new, revived Louvre. And the event happens on the 17th of October in 1665. And Louis XIV lays a foundation stone for Bernini's design, and within the kind of foundations are buried two commemorative plaques which give details of, you know, both the king and the design and who designed it and the people involved, but also a specially commissioned commemorative medal. Now we're seeing what a medal looks like here. Obviously it's blown up out of all proportions, it's about this big. And the medal has a portrait of the king on one side, and the inscription says, Louis XIV reigns and builds. And on the other side, we have a representation of Bernini's design for the new Louvre facade. And the idea was this was made out of solid gold. And it was buried in the foundations, cemented into the foundations, to imagine that, you know, in the future, when all that was once this great empire of the Bourbon regime might be in ruins, some archaeologists might be able to come along and dig through the foundations and find this commemorative marker which tells us what this great building once looked like, and also tell us something of the great man, the king who commissioned that building. Now, this medal was designed and made by the greatest medalist of the age, Jean Varin. And Jean Varin shows, we have a record of Jean Varin showing this medal to Bernini. And Bernini says to him, because Bernini doesn't really like French art, it must be said, and he's not very kind to his French colleagues, and he doesn't have much good to say, and it really doesn't help his case, it must be said. But he says, Bernini declares that the medal is too high relief to Vaughan. And Vaughan said, being a consummate courtier, Vaughan says, that was how Monsieur Colbert liked it. But he was delighted to say that the Cavalieri, as they call Bernini, he was delighted to say that it should be in lower relief, as that was his opinion too. And so this idea that there's a few things going on here, we understand that Louis XIV's cultural minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, has told Vaughan how the medal should look, and that Vaughan agrees with the great Bernini that in fact the best medals are low relief, and that allows him to show off his skill to a greater extent. So kind of the fascinating machinations of royal representation taking place both in the design of this building and the sort of commemorative coin that's just meant to be buried in the foundations. It doesn't take long after Bernini leaves France for all of his great plans to go awry, however. He leaves his son there, but French artists start to whisper against him. They start to say, we can do better. French art can exceed Italian art. We don't need this kind of excessive taste of the Italians. We can do better, and we have the right people to help us execute a better design. So they put together a small council, a petit conseil, and it's a group of people, including the architect Louis Levaux, the great artist Charles Lebrun, and also the kind of humanist architect, doctor, medicine, one of those great Renaissance men, Claude Perrault. And Claude Perrault designs a new French classical style for the Louvre. It becomes the quintessential kind of emblem of French classicism, and it adheres to principles that Perrault has learnt from Vitruvius, the ancient writer who tells us all about classical architecture and so on. And of course, one of Perrault's most famous tasks is to translate Vitruvius from Latin into French. And so this idea of scholarship sponsored by the court and a more kind of researched, learned classical style emerging through the king's patronage is represented in a new facade. Bernini's facade never gets built. But let's think a little more about Vaughan. I'm showing you here a fascinating painting, a painting that's fascinated me for a long time. It's a double portrait of Jean Vaughan, the older man, pointing to a coin, an ancient coin, and next to him is the young King Louis XIV. And this painting is supposed to represent Vaughan teaching Louis XIV about ancient history via coins. We know that Vaughan was a man who was intimately connected to the French court. He had a close personal relationship with Louis XIV. And it's for these reasons that he holds a lot of sway. And in fact, he can help to dictate the kind of taste and the kind of representation, particularly in the early part of the reign. And we know that Louis XIV develops a great interest in coins and medals. He becomes one of the great collectors of coins and medals of the 17th century. And it's probably from his lessons with Vaughan in childhood, in the 1640s, that he begins to appreciate those objects. What's really interesting, actually, about this painting is it's painted in two phases. It's painted at the time, we think, of Vaughan teaching the young king, but then it's added to later. And this is where we're not quite sure who makes this, but we know here's another of Vaughan's medal portraits of Louis XIV. And it's been added to the frame of that portrait later. Makes me think that perhaps that painting was owned by Vaughan himself. And although we don't have any paintings that survive by him, we know that he was recognised as a great painter in his day too. So that's still up for grabs, and we don't have the evidence, but something that has fascinated me and many others for a while. Let's think about this bust, though. This bust of Louis XIV by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Because not only did Bernini create his designs for the Louvre, whilst he was in France, he made a portrait of the king, and he fascinated the king by his technique. He had a very peculiar method. He would this isn't a kind of a direct, I'm going to take a drawing or work from you from life and then, create an exact replica of man. Bernini didn't believe that's how you made a portrait. Instead, he'd turn up for many sessions to sketch the king from peculiar angles. The king would chuckle, apparently, as we're told, as Bernini, this old man by the stage, would crouch down and look up at him from beneath his chin and sort of take these peculiar perspectives to try. He thought that if he could imprint in his brain, via drawing, an image of the king, that would allow him to sculpt a true likeness of the king. So Bernini was less concerned with replicating a kind of exact shape and proportions of his sitter's head, and he was more interested in capturing a likeness that, in his view, could only be achieved through a kind of strategic deviation from nature. So that's a kind of interesting thing for us to think about. So this is something, and I should say that, we have a lot of information about Bernini's portrait, the creation of Bernini's portrait of Louis XIV, via diaries written by a man, his handler, if you like, in France, Paul Frère de Chanteloup, and he writes these capacious kind of diaries about the Cavalieri's visit, and so we have lots of anecdotal information about it, and we have some quotes from Bernini too. So there's some discussion about Bernini's technique. And Bernini says this to Chanteloup about the difficulty of representing a figure in marble. If a man bleached his hair, his beard, his eyebrows, and if it were possible, the pupil of his eyes and his lips, and showed himself in this state to those who were accustomed to see him every day, they would have difficulty in recognizing him. For this reason, it is extremely hard to get a likeness in marble that is all of one color. That to imitate nature in marble may be necessary to put in that which is not there, sometimes in a marble portrait. In order to represent the dark, which some people have around their eyes, one must hollow out the marble, in this way obtaining a kind of effect of colour and supplementing, so to speak, the art of sculpture, which cannot give colour to things. So naturalism is not the same as imitation. That's what Bernini says. But he comes unstuck, unfortunately, poor Bernini, by, again, the strange machinations of court. You'll notice from this portrait that the king is wearing a magnificent wig, but it's parted in the middle there. Yeah? So you can see the forehead. Now, a prominent courtier coming to see this, because, in fact, poor old Bernini, he has an audience all the time of courtiers coming constantly to see the great man work, and he can't get away with anything. And one of the householders of, one of the people, the courtiers of Louis XIV, the Marquis de Bellefonds, told Bernini, it must have annoyed the man a great deal, told Bernini that he was upset that he'd exposed the king's forehead, and the king would never wear his hair in that way. There was a huge discussion about this, but the king doesn't wear his hair that way. You can't show the king's forehead. Peculiar. And why? Because the king actually has scars on his forehead from, smallpox infection from when he was younger, and, that's possibly the reason that he covers his forehead. And it's also a matter of fashion. So what does Bernini do? Bernini, probably rolling his eyes a great deal, decides to create a little forelock here in the forehead. But that's a problem. And so, it goes on. People say, oh gosh, what's Bernini done? He's created this forelock. And so, and this is a quote from Chanteloup, everybody asked Jean Vaughan what he thought about the bust. And Vaughan says that he thought that the Cavalieri had taken too much off the forehead and marble couldn't be put back. But, then people are sort of rallying around. It's like, what do we do about this? This is a bit embarrassing. And so Chanteloup, who's a great friend by this stage of Bernini, assures him that this is not so, and that, in fact, the Cavalieri intended to give deep modelling to the forehead above the eyes, which would not only be true to life, but which would follow the style of the most beautiful heads of antiquity. And another great antiquarian scholar comes in and says, his name is Pierre Séguin, and he pulls out a coin of Alexander the Great. And he says, a portrait of Alexander the Great, which I'm showing you an example of here, and says, in fact, by hollowing out the forehead in that way, he has created these magnificent brow humps. And those brow humps are found in the portrait of Alexander the Great, in fact, imbuing this portrait of Louis XIV with all the grandeur of the ancients. So people are very keen to sort of support the reason behind this. But of course, those followers of Vaughan are not quite so sure. So what does Vaughan do? He creates his own bust. He goes into competition. We don't know a great deal about, there isn't a lot in terms of specifics, but we certainly know from the evidence that survives that Vaughan buys the marble in 1665 for this bust. And we know that shortly after it's presented, people refer to him as the new Praxiteles. People refer to him as magnificent. And we also have some evidence from Bernini's son writing back and saying, oh, people are saying all this about Vaughan's bust, how marvellous Vaughan's bust is. Well, you'd expect the king's medalist to be able to get a good likeness of him at least. You know, but there is only Bernini can go beyond what is in nature to create a sense of true magnificence. So there is this kind of rivalry that's set up between Bernini, who deviates from nature, to create a magnificent portrait. And in fact, if we believe the argument, does things like slightly alter the physiognomy, to expose the forehead, which he says is one of the principal sites of physiognomy, one of the ways that we can read the character through the face, and indeed creates these brow humps which imbue the figure, with a historical sense of magnificence. Vaughan's bust is fascinating for us because, of course, it's in a very different style, but it's what we might think of as more of a this kind of classical manner French style, which becomes the standard for representations of Louis XIV. And I think that we can see in Vaughan's bust a taste for surface detail that you'd associate with somebody who's working in relief on a medal. And you can see that through the Apollo sun disk, which is on the breastplate there. That's the representation of the sun god Apollo, of course, to make the link between Louis XIV as the Sun King and so on, the patron of the arts and so on. There's also this kind of representation with the swags and folds of the Roman armour with its leather lappets and the cloak there. But then, you know, correctly you have the wig, and I think it must be noted that there is no exposed forehead in Vaughan's bust. So I urge you, when you go into the exhibition, you know, and meet this sculpture as you walk into the first room, to have a close look at all that marvellous detail and see how Vaughan has managed to work from 3 dimensions right down into the lowest form of relief to create this really extraordinarily detailed sculpture. And it is that taste for detail that I argue brings in this kind of medalist sensibility into the work. And what can it tell us about, I'm giving you here just an example, a couple more examples of Vaughan's, again, bringing them back, his medal sculptures. And you can also see, I mean, it's actually quite fascinating if you look closely. Vaughan is very interested in accurate physiognomy. And there is a lot of literature back in the 17th century about the way that one can read character through physiognomy and how this has a kind of a historical import. You know, we can see, some people say, by way of the ancient coins, what the characters of the ancients were like, because we can read their faces. Well, it seems to me that this idea of accuracy in portraiture was about that too. They wanted to give an accurate sense of what Louis XIV looked like, because he was seen as the consummate king, and therefore he represented a new model for physiognomy. This is what a king looks like. And indeed, Vaughan draws attention to the principal aspects of physiognomy through profile, and you can see the high forehead, that large kind of aquiline nose, the strong chin. All of these things are seen as positives in physiognomic study back in the 17th century. So, you know, it's interesting thinking about this, isn't it? Bernini's deviation from visual truth imbues it with a kind of symbolic physiognomy, whereas Vaughan's accurate depiction creates a kind of a new model for kingly physiognomy. And I think, I also wanted to tell you that Vaughan's bust, it's Vaughan's bust that's placed in pride of place in the Chateau of Versailles. What's now gone, the ambassador's staircase, was the great triumphal entry space of the chateau. It's where all the great audiences would enter the court, and Louis XIV, it's said, would stand on the staircase. He would come down the stairs, proportionately to how important you were, although we don't have a huge amount of evidence for that. It's a nice idea, though. The idea is this is a great space of, magnificence, and the first figure that you would greet as you come into that space is Vaughan's bust. It gives you a sense of the importance of that bust. Another thing to say about that, though, is that bust is replaced as the king ages. So the idea of representing the king accurately in visual form is important in a kind of space of representation like this. And in fact, the artist Antoine Coisevaux creates 2 more busts to be placed on that special pedestal in the ambassador's staircase as the king ages. But one thing I wanted to just end with thinking about a little bit was what all this means for representations of Louis XIV more generally as time goes on. And I think we can be quite startled sometimes by how unflinching and unflattering those late portraits of Louis XIV are. Here's a man who, through a series of very horrific dental procedures, has lost most of his teeth and in fact part of his upper palate, so much so that when he sipped wine it came out through his nose, and they had to cauterize his upper palate with a hot poker. All sorts of horrible things have happened to this poor man. And it's left him with a sunken mouth. And that sunken mouth is accurately depicted in the famous portrait of Yssaint Rigaud, and there's a copy of that in the exhibition, and also the very famous true-to-life wax portrait of Benoit. And there's also a Benoit in the exhibition too. It's not this one, but it's another kind of medallion portrait. How do we understand these gruesome late portraits? Well, I would argue that it's all about this kind of accuracy and truth to physiognomy that we find in that early moment of the 1660s with Jean Vaughan. You know, we find this moment where we move beyond a kind of symbolic representation of physiognomy to an accurate representation of physiognomy. This is what the king looks like, and this is what magnificence looks like. And that sort of means that, you know, however the king might look, that's how magnificence should be portrayed. So truth to physiognomy was in fact seen as a positive, where it might seem to us as strangely unflattering. So I'd like to finish there. Thank you.
We do have some time for some questions. If you just pop your hand up and I'll bring the microphone around so Dr. Robert Wellington can hear.
So that gold medallion you showed us, was it dug up? How did they get it?
They made other copies, actually. So it's an interesting thing, and that particular one that I'm showing you is in the collection of now the National Library in Paris, and it was in the Royal Collection, so Louis XIV would have had his own copy. And of course, when people would come to visit the Royal Medals collection, as they often did, and often that was presented to them by the king, he might show them that medal. It was, you know, one of the treasures. And people talk about it in terms of its weight and the amount of gold. You know, it's seen as a very special kind of magnificent item. But they did bury gold ones, and the reason was that they saw gold as a material that wouldn't degrade and therefore had a longer life, and it was a better kind of chance of surviving. Yeah, fascinating, I think.
Information overload, maybe. It was wonderful, thank you. If you'd all like to join me in thanking Dr. Robert Wellington for Art for Lunch today.